Okay, hi everyone. Hi again. Today, what I want to do in this small lecture is talk to you a little bit about Muscovy and its neighbors, although I'll mention people that aren't precisely neighbors. And the reason that I want to do this is to set that groundwork for our understanding of some of what goes on during the time of troubles. And just to have a more general sense as well of some of the dynamics at work in Eastern Europe. And one of the primary dynamics, there's kind of two primary dynamics that I want to come across to you in this lecture. Dynamic one, three dynamics, but and the third one will get short shrift in this lecture and we'll talk about it later. So dynamic one, I want you to have some sense of what the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was and how it's significant in Russian history. Number two, we'll start building an understanding of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Russia's long-term rivalry with Poland. And number three, and this is probably the most, the least tangible, but most significant point that I want to come across in this lecture. And that is the complicated confessional dynamics in this part of the world. So keep your eyes out for pagans and Orthodox and Catholics and Protestants, because those different religious faiths, I think, play a real role in some of the geopolitical dynamics that are at work in Eastern Europe in the 16th century. And of course, to say that shouldn't be a surprise to us, because we are looking at and studying a part of the world in which there's no sense of a separation between church and state. There's no real demarcation between one's spiritual, one's religion and one's civic identity. That's a modern identity. Those are modern distinctions that come later. So even as this shouldn't surprise us, I want us to appreciate some of the ways that this complicated mix of confessional and political loyalties plays out in early modern Eastern Europe. So just a little bit of backtracking, perhaps. We've been talking about ambassadors, including Anthony Jenkinson, Jeremy Horsey, and others that come from England, not a direct neighbor. But just so you know, in case you didn't have it right on your radar screen, there's a bunch of religious flux in England as the 16th century proceeds as well. Henry VIII, who rules from 1509 to 1547, so he dies in the year that Ivan IV goes from his minority to majority rule, the year he gets married, the year he starts calling himself Tsar. Henry VIII began as a Catholic, even writes a treatise. He was one of the more learned kings of the 16th century, and he was very famous for much that he did in the way of successful state building. He, among other accomplishments, wrote a treatise defending the church, for which he was titled, the Pope awarded him a title of Defender of the Church, which was somewhat ironic because in the 1530s, he broke with the Pope. Although his break with the church, as many of you know, had everything to do with politics and not much to do with faith. He was not a fan of Martin Luther, but he broke with the church because the church would not grant him a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. And perhaps part of the reason that the Pope would not grant him a divorce from his longtime wife, Catherine of Aragon, was because she was a Spanish woman and Spanish armies were occupying Rome at the time. So there, on this theme of kind of the play between politics and religion, shining example that many of you probably know about that. Actually, don't let me get sucked into English history, but I just wanted to show you this slide because sometimes when we are reading in the sources, whether it's Elizabeth or James or someone else, just to kind of get you straight. Henry VIII, first half pretty much of the 16th century, he starts out Catholic, he breaks with the church, And at the time, they're kind of calling it Reformed. His religion isn't so fundamentally different. Even at the time, they get called Henrican Catholics, kind of Catholics of the Henry sort. And then the name eventually emerges as Anglican, which means the Church of England. His son, however, takes the throne when he passes, and he, son of Catherine of Aragon, is raised, pardon me, and Edward is of the Reformed faith, not son of Catherine of Aragon. Edward is of the Reformed faith, and so England kind of continues on that path for a short while. He unfortunately dies quite early, and he's succeeded by Mary Tudor. She, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, has been raised Catholic and is Catholic. And we see, and this causes a lot of strain in England. Her reign is also fairly short, and she's succeeded by Anne Boleyn's daughter, who'd been beheaded, Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I is of the Reformed faith. And she has a long, quite successful and largely stabilizing reign, ruling from 1558 to 1603. It is Elizabeth who is very much presiding over the Muscovy Company's emerging relations with England. And as I mentioned to you before, Ivan writes letters to Elizabeth proposing marriage in more than one scheme, and she ignores him. Total Heisman. But she had, Ivan wasn't unique in this. She had many, many suitors. The Virgin Queen had quite a few monarchical offers in her decades on the throne. At any rate, when she passed away in 1603, she is the last Tudor monarch, and she was succeeded by James I of England. He was also James VI of Scotland. And coming back to this theme of kind of the mix of confessions in the 16th and even lasting into the early 17th century, he was baptized Catholic with a Catholic mother, but was raised as a Protestant. So even just taking a quick look at the English throne so that we can get straight who's getting letters from whom as Muscovy is developing its relations with England, we see that religious churn going on. James I, also at his throne, he rules from 1603 to 1625, and it is on his throne where he has people approaching him to send a fleet and seize the northern parts of Russia already, as England is just emerging as a real maritime power. The English defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is one of those points in history as we start to see England as an emergent maritime power. But even that victory was more a result of weather and Spanish catastrophe than English maritime prowess. Nonetheless, just decades later, in the first decade of the 17th century, you have some people at the court of James I trying to get the king's ear to say, you should launch an attack on the northern coasts of Muscovy. There's really wealthy farmers there, and we think that's in our interests. Okay. Way over in England, we see, just to kind of get a sense of the middle of the 16th century, Charles V is presiding and retiring in 1555 his rulership over the massive Habsburg Empire, which contains not only Spain, and someone in Herberstein's party, as you recall, is returning back from a diplomatic trip to Spain, but also the Holy Roman Empire here, a very complicated conglomeration. And they're down in Rome as well. That's why the Pope isn't going to grant that annulment from Catherine of Aragon for Henry V. And so here's just kind of a picture, getting our bearings of the map of Europe in the 16th century. I want to show you this picture to turn your attention to religion. As you know, in 1517, Martin Luther, this Catholic theologian who has numerous concerns, largely emanating from the practices of indulgences that get him thinking about all the things the Catholic Church isn't doing right. He posts his 95 Theses for a variety of reasons, because there have been people that have been criticizing the church for a long time, and well, we'll stop there. And the Reformation happens. Christendom, or we already know that we have an Orthodox world off to the east, but Latin Christendom had pretty much hung together as one unit since the kind of conversion in late Roman times to Christianity. But now it is fragmented into a variety of faiths. Kind of Reformed faith will become Lutheranism. I told you about Anglicanism, Calvinism, Zwinglianism, Anabaptism, and a whole slew of various flavors of Christianity emerge. And so I want you to be aware of that context. And it starts in the 16th century. Here is if that map isn't too helpful. So in this map, we've got kind of dark orange being Reformed faith, light orange being a place where Reformed faith is growing. So turn your attention here to Eastern Europe. And then this map might be a little bit more useful. Here is a kind of 16th, early 17th century map. Actually, it is later in the Reformation, because one big storyline of the Reformation is that the Counter-Reformation, by which the Catholic Church launches, actually turns out to be super successful. So if you look at a map in 1550 or in 1560, a map of Europe is going to look more Protestant than it's going to look in 1660, because of the success of the Catholic Church in kind of gaining back believers. At any rate, so this map here, green is Catholic, pink is Orthodox, and you'll notice here the Ottoman Empire that has moved into southeastern Europe, in Hungary, those territories in the early 16th century, is presiding in large part over Orthodox Catholics. And then here in this Polish-Lithuanian territory, which we'll get a better sense of, you have mixed faith. We'll kind of pause right there and switch gears from faith to fighting. You don't really need to know this, but a real quick picture of what happened in Russia under Ivan IV, as repeating what we know. He conquers Kazan, he conquers Astrahan, so to the east, he's making all kinds of progress. And then all along, Russia does have to deal with, down on the Crimean Peninsula, the Crimean Tatars launch raids into Russia, a really serious one in 1571. I'll tell you more about that when we talk about Siberia. So you have some conquests to the east, you have Russia dealing with raids from the south, and then you have Russia being the aggressor in its western borders. Ivan IV wants a foothold on the Baltic, launches the Livonian War, which initially goes well, but not so well in the end. And when it's all over, Russia has spent much in terms of lives and treasure and doesn't have a foothold, the foothold it wanted on the Livonian border. Eric of Sweden is presiding over much of, or just a portion of this rule. I won't go too far into Sweden as well, just to show you that Sweden is the big power up here. Finland as such doesn't exist yet, and then they'll expand a little bit more. Sweden into the 18th century, in the 18th century, it is one of the biggest armies. It is one of the largest armies. It has one of the largest armies, and is one of the most militarized states. So and it's a major rival of Russia. Okay, now I want to get into put the Grand Duchy of Lithuania on your radar screen. So the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, you can think of as a state. And if you go to Wikipedia, it'll tell you that it exists from 1236 to 1795. Fair enough, but in those centuries, there's quite a bit of evolution. One thing to know that some of you already are aware of is that this corner of Europe, this northeastern corner of Europe up there near the Baltics, is one of the last areas to become Christianized. And in the 13th century, so the early 1200s, the Teutonic Knights launch a crusade against the pagans up there in the Baltics. And so you have the Lithuanian king or prince. There's a real fascinating history of what people are called a when, and if they're called a prince or if they're called a king. And one thing that I think I've mentioned to you, even UNM, Yulia Mikhailova, who wrote her dissertation at UNM, one of the things that her dissertation argued was that maybe even this word rex doesn't exist, isn't used regularly as far back in Western European history as we'd like to think, and that later historians translated it. And what are the implications of some of this? Well, certainly we generally think that a king is a higher ranking than a prince. And circle back around to this question that came up of what did Russians think that Tsar meant, which was a question in one of our previous meetings. In their sources, Russians talk about Roman emperors and they talk about Mongol Khans as Tsar. So when Ivan IV adopted that permanent title, and his grandfather, Ivan III, had played with it a little bit, but hadn't used it all the time. But when Ivan IV took on as his regular and first title, Tsar, Moscow was sending a message that we are a ruler, this is a state and our ruler is on par with the emperors of Rome and the Mongol Khan. So it is saying something about its self-perception. At any rate, Mindaugas, king, the first king to convert to Christianity is Mindaugas, and he takes on Latin Christianity in 1256. Some generations later, in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, there's this important, this ruler I want you to know about, because I think he represents an important dynamic that I'm trying to get us to appreciate here. Now, and the dynamic is the churn of multiple religions, and the ruler is Gediminas. He rules from 1316 to 1341. Though he has been succeeded by a Christian ruler, he himself was pagan. Without going into much detail, I just want to put on your radar screen, and I want you to be aware that he's pagan. Although he understands that Christianity is a really big player, he communicates with the papacy. He actually agrees to convert to Latin Christianity. But as events proceed, he reneges on this agreement to be baptized into Latin Christianity. And for a long time, maybe historians just took this as an example of what a barbaric pagan. But subsequent historians have come along, and here I'm drawing on an interpretation from Robert Crummy in this book, The Formation of Muscovy, although he's not the only one to point that out, but rather to present Gediminas as someone who was much more savvy in declining to accept Latin Christianity, because in his midst, on his territory, there were a lot of Orthodox nobles. So there's Orthodox nobles, and there's Latin Christian or Catholic nobles, and he is aiming to keep both of them in his sway, have both of these types of nobles be in his retinue and ready to fight for him should they be called up into campaign, as well as having pagans in his midst. And so he makes a savvy decision that rather than go all the way towards Catholicism or all the way to Orthodoxy, he maintains his pagan status. So we'll say more about religion. The other now, so that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, it will expand and contract, and this map here shows you that. Basically, all these different colors indicate different periods in time in which in which it expands, and its greatest extent is reached in the 1400s. But something else important happens. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania is going to pair with the Kingdom of Poland. So they are effectively going to be one unit. It officially happens in 1569, but there's these treaties well before that show it's already happening. And one of the first moments that we see that union is already happening, or we're on the road to that union, it happens in 1386, and that's the Union of Krevo. And it creates a dynastic union between Poland and Lithuania. And at the head of the Lithuanian throne at that moment is the Jagiellonian dynasty, which will be a long-lasting, glorious dynasty over time. So, and that union, it's just between rulers. It doesn't really change the laws or tax collection or merge treasuries or armies or do anything like that. It's just, well, maybe what I just said overstates the situation given personal rulership of the time. But that said, it's just a union between thrones. Here's a different image of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in the late 14th and early 15th century. So you see it covering this large swath of Eastern Europe. Here it is imposed on a map now. So here you have Russia, here you have Ukraine, here you have Belarusia, here you have Baltic states. So what was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania ends up covering some of all of what those states are now. It's largely Slavic. It's not entirely Slavic. Here I could show you a bunch of maps. Here's a different map of Eastern Europe in the 1500s, and it in 1500, and it still shows kind of the Kazan Khanate as a major power there, and Muscovy is smaller, doesn't really reach down here into what we now see as Ukraine by a long shot. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania is brown here, and we notice Kiev, which is in Ukraine, is squarely in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. One thing I want you to notice here on this map is the extent of the Ottoman Empire reaching into Eastern Europe. 1453, they conquered Constantinople, and then they continue bit by bit to move into Eastern Europe, where they're already fighting battles in Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1529 against the Habsburgs. It's one of the reasons they're really interested in Russia. But back to Lithuania. So here's another map where this map does put Moldavia as a more substantial on its own kingdom. Here we see the Kingdom of Poland. Here's Lithuania, with down here we have a different color, kind of dependent territories. And one thing I'd show you here is, here's the city of Lviv. Lviv is a city in Western Ukraine. Now, and kind of just to catapult forward in history, Lviv is only annexed by Stalin in World War II. Prior to that, it spends much of its history as in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as part of the Austrian Empire. And perhaps it's no mistake then that Lviv is largely considered to be a hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism, or people that understood themselves to be Ukrainians and part of an entity, or aspiring to be part of an entity that didn't want to be part of the Russian Empire, didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union. All right, I'm back to this Grand Duchy of Lithuania, 1385 or 1386, depending on, we'll talk more about calendars. We have this union. 1387, Prince Jogailai converts to Christianity. So now the the leadership of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania from henceforth will always be part of the, will always be Christian. Now, I want to actually show you a different slide here that, that points to another important moment in this history. And that is in 1413, so kind of on this road, in 1413, we have a Union of Horadlo. In the Union of Horadlo, what happens is Polish noble privileges are extended to Catholic Lithuanian nobles. So what does that mean? Well, we've talked about this Union of Krevo. It's the dynastic thrones, that the Polish king is going to marry the Grand Prince of Lithuania is also going to be called the Polish king as well in this dynastic union. But Kingdom Poland as such, and the nobles that reside there, are going to continue largely to do their own thing. The Kingdom of Poland famously develops a tradition of a kingship with checks and balances. So when we started with Henry VIII, Henry VIII rules over this kingdom that starts to make aspirations to absolute rulership. Meaning, what's the law? The law is what the king says is the law. What are the checks on the king? There are no checks on the king beside what God himself might provide, because he is the divinely appointed ruler. Not so in Poland. Poland develops essentially they don't have a written constitution. They pass one in 1791, but they never get the chance to implement it because they're partitioned out of existence. But like England doesn't have a written constitution, they have a constitutional order in which the king is elected, in which the nobles enjoy a number of freedoms. And among those freedoms are the liberum veto. I'll elaborate on more on this later. I'm just giving us a first go around into kind of the Polish world. We'll come back around to this later. But liberum veto, anyone that is a member of the szlachta, which is kind of the word for Polish nobility, has the right to come to the Sejm, which is the Polish parliament, so to speak. And if they don't like what's about to being decided on, one person can impose, one Polish noble, one Polish szlachta has the privilege to impose a veto. And this tradition, okay, I'll editorialize a little bit. Early on, it gets very little implemented. People, they don't use it. There seems to be this restraint, this respect for the season, for the respect for the tradition and the power it holds. Something changes over time in the 16th and then 17th over history, where we see the liberum veto get used again and again and again. And if you can't pass anything, makes it hard for a government to function, be somewhat hamstringed, makes it hard to raise a big army. I'm simplifying here somewhat, but perhaps the dysfunction that emerges in the Polish kingdom may play some role in the fact that Austria, Russia, and Prussia were able to get together and dismantle this state at the diplomatic table. It wasn't just a problem from without. Poland had problems from within. That evolved. We can talk more about that. Another one of the golden freedoms was the Confederation, that if a group of nobles were really displeased with the direction that the king was taking, they could get together and they could form a confederation to not go along with what the king wanted. These were some of the golden freedoms. But let me, so without going farther, too much farther into that, you can imagine, so you have this state with a tradition of strong nobles, we're going to elect a king, and that was what the Jagiellonian kings were. At a different point in time, they'll have a French king, King Henry, sit on the throne. And they were just fine with that, because the less interested the king was in Poland, the better it was for the most powerful Polish nobles to just do their own bidding and not have some troublesome king about. At any rate, that's a little bit farther down. But here in the Union of Geraldo, this dynamic that I want to really turn our attention to. This Union of Geraldo extended Polish noble privileges to Lithuania. So kind of, rather than just being the monarchs, the king and queen, or a monarch dynastic union, now it's extending to the layer below. But it's extending not to the Orthodox nobles, it's extending to the Catholic nobles. And this makes Orthodox nobles very, very uncomfortable. This is still long before the Reformation, but I think even understanding that dynamic, you can start to see how when the Reformation comes into play, and there's even more of a mix, what a complicated world we have. So then in a century, well over a century after that, we have the Union of Lublin. And the Union of Lublin is the moment where the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth gets formed. They will come together as two states, and they will kind of have a joint selm. Here is a map of it. This is actually a confessional map, but there in that orange, you see in the whole of Europe where this state was. And in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, so it begins 1569 with the Union of Lublin. It ends in 1795 with the final partition of Poland, no longer exists. And at its peak, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is the largest territorial state in Europe. It is multi-ethnic. It is multi-confessional. It has a political system in which there are strong checks on the king, even as other monarchies to the west are experimenting and attempting to establish more absolutist rule unsuccessfully. And it has a high level of religious tolerance. I want to, and by that, let me point your attention to the Warsaw Confederation Act. Is an act in 1573 that says Polish nobles won't be punished for their faith. Even some Jews are ennobled in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You have some towns in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth where they will have a Reformed Mass and then they'll have a Catholic Mass in the same building. This, I want you to, if you remember one thing for the rest of your college career, 2 decades out, I want you to remember this, that while in 1572 in France, where they had Saint Bartholomew's Day in France, 1572, where Catholics just and Protestants had total massacres, one of the most horrific single set of days in a really horrific series of wars and religion. Just slightly to the east, 1 year later, with the 1573 Warsaw Confederation Act, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth pretty much says, we are not going to engage in confessional violence. And I guess I'm somewhat biased for Eastern Europe, but one of the things we often hear about is how civilized and advanced Western European countries are compared to your backward, more primitive Eastern European countries. And so I really want you to be aware of the fact that the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre happened in Paris, France in 1572. And in Poland 1 year later, they passed the Warsaw Confederation Act. This rosy story about happy multi-confessionalism, sadly, will go downhill as well, and we'll start to see more some religious persecution. But and even as that's a real kind of stark and happy example that we don't have government massacres against people of different faiths. Even Jewish pogroms were more grassroots, spontaneous endeavors, although to be sure, Alexander III was well aware of some of the pogroms that took place in the late 19th century, and as was Nicholas II. That said, even as I'm hitting this kind of happy, triumphant note for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, I do want you to know that there's a lot of tension between the Orthodox and the Catholic nobility. And the Catholic nobility with the, in the Union of Geraldo, it does sort of make Orthodox nobles somewhat second-class citizens. They don't have all the same privileges that Catholics in the realm have. And so that makes some of them turn towards Muscovy, this Orthodox state. Like maybe things will be better. If I'm a second-class noble here, maybe I can be a first-class noble there. And so we do have a little bit of, I won't give you lots of examples, or there is some Lithuanian nobles who go to the Muscovite prince and say, hey, I'll sign up and I'll be your subject. And at the same time as Muscovy's rising, so right, we had a lecture, we had 2 lectures talking about how Muscovy is gathering Russian lands and becoming more and more powerful, and all these other princes from Tver and Ryazan, etc., are seeing the Grand Prince in Moscow as the leader, the sovereign that they look to, the sovereign they're subordinate to, and then he even calls himself the Tsar of this Russian kingdom. So on the one hand, if you're a Lithuanian noble, maybe you don't want to be part of the Russian kingdom. You don't want to be part of Muscovy, but maybe you don't feel like you don't like being sort of a second-class citizen next to your Polish nobles. That said, in 1569, this union of Lublin that forms the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of the dynamics there that's going on is Poland saying, yo, Moscow's coming for you. Let's join forces so you can not become subject to Muscovy. And as much as maybe Orthodox nobles didn't like being slightly not having all the privileges that Catholic Poles had, some were persuaded by that offer. And some still resisted that offer. And along those lines, I want to show you this picture. This is a picture, again, 19th century, colorful, dramatic. And this is a picture of the Union of Lublin, written from the perspective of someone who didn't like the subordination to this union that Lithuanian nobles made in 1569. And so this is a picture of an important, powerful Lithuanian noble, Mykolai Radziwiłł, Mykolai the Red. He lived from 1515 to 1584. And he reportedly, when he agreed to this Union of Lublin, he did it on his knees with you see his sword down here that he's about to, as if he was being stabbed in the heart. And this painting represents that there were some that were very much not a fan of this union at all. So that is all, if not, I hope that's not too confusing, but main take-home points. The Duchy of Lithuania exists from medieval time, one of the latest, longest lasting pagan entities, has Catholics and Orthodox in its realm. And this joining with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is in part motivated by concerns about an advancing Muscovy. It results in a multi-confessional state that works for quite a while until it doesn't work. But even as it works, it kind of sets up this some tensions between over who's Orthodox in this entity and who's not Orthodox in this entity. Let's see, what else do I have on this slide? So Kiev is incorporated into, as we saw already, the Grand Duchy in 1362. already. Then it's in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And then it's only in 1686 that it's permanently made part of Muscovy, although it's temporarily in the 13 years war prior to that. So I kind of put that on your radar screen to kind of further reinforce this history we've already talked a little bit about, in that if you might have a great Russian who will say, Ukraine, little Russia, part of us, they're just like little Russians, and they really belong to be their own people. Kiev, the city of that, was part of a different entity for much of the early modern period. Here's just kind of lays out some of these things. We haven't talked about this extensively yet, except when we talked about Cossacks. I talked about the Khmelnytsky uprising. That includes many pogroms and persecutions of Jews in what's not now Ukrainian territory. And then this whole entity disappears from the map in a series of partitions from 1772 to 1795, where Russia, Prussia, and Austria come together to dismantle it. In my kind of Imperial Russia class, we go into that in detail. But something to just know generally is that Poland disappears from the map until after World War I. Napoleon gives it a little, the Duchy of Warsaw, he promises to put it back on the map. That's why so many Poles fought in Napoleon's armies, but it disappears from the map. Okay, I'm going to introduce some more facts into what I've been talking to you about, to underscore this history of kind of religious tension in this part of the world. And so here I have this slide titled Orthodoxy in Politics. 1569, Union of Lublin forms together the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. We know about that. 1573, we have the Warsaw Confederation Act. We're going to be tolerant of different religions. We're not going to engage in that bloodshed that we saw to the west. Now, in 1589, Moscow is raised from the status of metropolitan to patriarchate. Now, in the Orthodox Church, there's no single pope. The highest kind of jurisdictional status is patriarchate. And before Moscow, even the metropolitan was in Kiev, then moved to Vladimir, then moved to Moscow, which is a really big coup and helped raise Moscow's status. We've talked about that, right? But it's still a metropolitanate. It answers to the patriarchate in Constantinople. Well, in 1589, Moscow gets this huge boost when the Orthodox Patriarchate gets raised to the status of, gets this big boost when it gets a promotion from being a metropolitanate to patriarchate. Why is that significant? Because now it means that the closest, bigger authority to many of the Orthodox bishops and priests in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, all these Orthodox people, it's Moscow is the next person that they look to. Remember, all those Catholic nobles in Poland and the Polish leadership, they really didn't like that. And by the way, I should note, it wasn't like Constantinople was super on board with this idea. Pretty much a representative from Constantinople came to Moscow, and he was pretty much held hostage until Constantinople agreed to let Moscow become and call itself a patriarchate. So again, we've got some hardball politics here, but it looks really good for Moscow. But in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they hated this development. And so it probably comes as no surprise that it's just a few years after that, in 1596, that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth signs the Union of Brest. And the Union of Brest creates the Uniate Church, or the Greek Catholic Church. And basically, as I've mentioned this before, what is this? This church is essentially an Orthodox church that answers to the Pope. The reason being, we think it's probably too big of a project to convert all those Orthodox peasants and Midland people out there on our realm, but we really don't want them thinking of Moscow as their leader, because Moscow is kind of a state on the rise anyway. So it is kind of using religion to advance a political end of allegiance. So that's another really big dynamic. And as I mentioned, now recall one of the things I said to you when we talked about Cossacks. And that was how Cossacks go from being this more diverse group of freebooters to really being seen as defenders of orthodoxy. And that shift is in part tied up with this sense that once you had the Union of Brest, that you had a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that was kind of hostile or not pro-Orthodoxy, and that Orthodoxy on this territory of what was now Ukraine needed defenders. Okay, with that, I will stop and we can take some questions.